Okay, so you know how sometimes when you're prepping for those big exams, those master's entrance exams in English, you come across these reading passages that just make you want to go, oof.
Oh, yeah, totally. Those ones that are like, are they even speaking English anymore? What is happening here?
Exactly. And we got one from you guys, Text6, and a bunch of you were like, help, please break this down. So that's our deep dive today. We're going to show you how to handle this one. And any other tricky academic reading you come across, even if you feel like your English reading is a little, how do I put it?
Rusty, a little bit out of
Yeah,
practice. So it's
exactly.
kind of like a mini workout, but for reading. And what's cool is this text is about the U.S. economy. It basically tells a story about how things went after World War II. And it's almost like two parts. First, this huge success story, then things get a bit rough in the mid-'80s, and then boom, back up again in the mid-'90s.
Yeah, a real roller coaster ride for the U.S. economy.
Exactly. So boom, challenge, recovery. It's a classic story arc.
Okay, so we're going to take this kind of beast of a text and tame it right. We'll break down those sentences that just seem to go on forever and explain any words that make you go, huh. And then we'll really get into those multiple choice questions because those can be a bit sneaky sometimes. But by the end of this, you'll be like, okay, I can handle this.
Gotcha. Yeah, those multiple choice questions. You're like, wait, all of these answers seem wrong. How am I supposed to do this one?
Right. All right, let's start by just getting a feel for the overall picture. Like, what's this text really about?
Okay, so picture this. The U.S., right after World War II, that's the setting of that first paragraph.
Yeah.
What jumps out at you when you read it?
Well, it seems like everything was amazing for the U.S. economy. It's like they were winning at everything. It's this glowing period, which makes it sound pretty darn good. And it mentions the U.S. market being like 8 times larger than any competitor.
Yeah.
That's a lot bigger. It's like if we were in a pie eating contest and you ate 8 pies and I only ate 1.
Yeah, you'd definitely be winning that contest. And that's kind of the point here, right? Not enough competition can lead to massive growth, but also maybe you get a little too comfy, which can cause problems later on. It also mentions something called unparalleled economies of scale. Imagine a factory that makes socks, and they make a tiny amount. Each sock ends up being really expensive to make. But if they make tons of socks, they can buy the materials way cheaper, and their machines are constantly working, which makes each sock cheaper to produce in the end. That's economies of scale, basically.
So the more you make, the cheaper it gets to make each one.
Exactly.
Makes sense.
And the U.S. was doing this better than anyone else at the time.
Okay, and it wasn't just about being big, right? The text also talks about how the U.S. had like the world's best scientists and the most skilled workers, and the standard of living was like prosperous beyond the dreams of those in Europe and Asia. Why was that again?
Yeah, because the war had basically wrecked their economies, right? So the U.S. had this amazing combo, big skilled and almost no competition. Talk about a recipe for success.
But of course, nothing lasts forever. What happens next?
Well, in that second paragraph, things start to shift. Can you spot the turning point there?
Yeah, it says it was like bound to happen, inevitable that this primacy should have narrowed as other countries grew richer.
Right. It's like when you're a kid and you're the tallest in your class, but then everyone else starts catching up and eventually you're not the tallest anymore.
Yeah, exactly. And the text says, just as inevitably, the retreat from predominance proved painful. That word painful, that tells you it wasn't exactly smooth sailing.
No kidding. So they're not top dog anymore and it's not a fun experience. What are some of the specific examples the text gives?
Yeah, it dives into industries that were struggling in the mid-'80s in the U.S. Like what stood out to you there? Well, consumer electronics, for sure. It says this industry had basically shrunk or vanished. Poof, gone. Because other countries were making things better or cheaper or both. It even gives that example of Zenith, the last American TV maker, got bought out by a South Korean company. That says a lot, right? Like, it's like if your favorite bakery suddenly had to close down because a giant supermarket started selling cheaper bread right next door.
Yeah, exactly. No one's going to the bakery anymore.
Sad but true.
What else?
The text also says foreign-made cars and textiles were basically taking over the U.S. market, sweeping into the domestic market, is how it's put. Imagine all the different brands of cars you see driving around now.
Yeah.
Many are not American-made. That's a real-world example of this. Oh, and the machine tool industry, you know, the one that makes the machines that actually make stuff?
Yeah.
It was on the ropes. Imagine a boxer who's been hit really hard and is barely standing. That's what on the ropes means for an industry.
Basically in big trouble. Yikes.
Yeah.
Anything else? Yeah, there was even worry about semiconductors, those tiny chips that make computers and smartphones and everything work. The text says it seemed like it might be the next one to go down. So yeah, American industries were facing some serious challenges.
No kidding.
Yeah.
So all this leads to this crisis of confidence that the third paragraph talks about. What was going on there?
Well, it was like this collective oh no moment for America. They'd been on top for so long, they'd started to believe it would always be that way, and then suddenly it wasn't.
So they're like, wait a minute, are we doing something wrong?
Yeah, exactly. They start to worry about their businesses, about their incomes. There were even investigations into why American industry was struggling, and everyone's pointing fingers at that overseas competition. It was a time of uncertainty and self-doubt. Not a good feeling.
But then something happens in the fourth paragraph. What
Yeah.
gives?
Well, around 1995, things take a turn for the better, a positive turn. The U.S. has 5 years of solid growth, which is basically a fancy way of saying the economy was doing really well. And at the same time, Japan, which had become a huge economic power, was having its own problems. The text makes it clear most people didn't think this was just a coincidence, like, oh, the dollar's weak or whatever. It felt like something bigger was happening.
So what was it? Why the turnaround?
Well, the text suggests it was about the U.S. economy adapting to the competition, becoming more efficient. It's like they took that hit, got back up, and said, all right, we need to change things up. The 1990s recovery is actually a great example of how a big economy can bounce back by making changes and focusing on doing things better.
So they went from feeling totally unsure to feeling like they were back on top.
Yeah, basically the mood shifted from self-doubt to what the text calls blind pride. And to show this, the author throws in a few expert opinions. What did those folks have to say?
Well, one guy, Richard Kavanaugh, he said that American industry has changed its structure, has gone on a diet, has learned to be more quick-witted. It's like saying they had to get leaner and meaner and faster on their feet.
Exactly, become more adaptable.
Right. And then Stephen Moore, he was all about how American businesses were improving their productivity.
Mm-hmm.
So basically doing more with less.
Efficiency at its best.
And then William Salmon, he really went for it. He called it a possible golden age of business management for the U.S. So these experts seem to think that it wasn't just luck, it was real improvements within American companies themselves that led to this comeback.
Totally. So we've got this big picture overview, but now let's zoom in on some of these sentences. There's that one in the first paragraph that's a bit of a mouthful. A history of long and effortless success can be a dreadful handicap, but if properly handled, it may become a driving force. Oof.
Yeah.
How can we make that easier to digest?
Yeah, it's a long one. It's like, okay, so think of it this way. If you've always had it easy, you never had to really try at something. Then when things get tough, you might not know how to handle it. That's the dreadful handicap. But if properly handled, meaning if you learn from your past success, it may become a driving force. It can actually push you forward, make you stronger. That word "but" is really important there. It's showing you there are two sides to this coin.
Yeah, a contrast between two possibilities.
So what you're saying is having things easy isn't always a good thing, but it can be if you use it the right way.
Exactly.
Okay, so let's break that sentence down a little more. What's the main subject and verb in the first part?
Okay, so the main subject is a history of long and effortless success. Kind of a mouthful, right?
Yeah.
And the main verb phrase is can be, which connects it to a dreadful handicap. So the simple idea is past easy success can be a problem.
All right, and then the second part, if properly handled, it may become a driving force. What's the main point there?
Okay, so that if properly handled part, that's like setting a condition. If you do this, then this might happen. And in this case, it, which refers back to that history of success, may become a driving force, which basically means something that motivates you and helps you succeed.
All right, cool. Another one from the second paragraph that kind of trips me up is, just as inevitably, the retreat from predominance proved painful. What's that inevitably doing there?
It's basically saying, as expected, or it was bound to happen. So this decline in the U.S. economy, it wasn't a surprise. It was kind of the natural result of other countries getting back on their feet and becoming more competitive. It connects back to the idea that you can't stay on top forever. Someone will eventually challenge you.
So it was bound to happen eventually. What's the main part of that sentence, though?
The main subject is the retreat from predominance. So that's the process of losing that top spot. And the verb is proved, and painful is describing the result. So basically, losing that top spot was a tough experience.
No kidding. Now I notice all these little words throughout the text, when, as, by, for a while. What are those all about?
Those are like the glue that holds the story together. They show you how different events are connected in time. When and as often mean things are happening at the same time. By can show you when something had happened or the way it was done. And for a while just means for a period of time. So basically, they help you follow the timeline of the story and understand how everything fits together.
So pay attention to those little words. They're important.
Oh, yeah, super important. They're sneaky like that.
Okay, let's move on to vocabulary. We talked about handicap earlier. Can you give us another example just to make sure we really get it?
Sure. So imagine a horse race where one horse has to carry extra weight. That extra weight is a handicap. It makes it harder for that horse to win. So basically, a handicap is anything that puts you at a disadvantage.
Got it. What about primacy?
Primacy means being the most important or the first in rank. So when the text talks about the U.S. losing its primacy, it means they were losing their position as the #1 economic power.
Makes sense. How about competitiveness?
That's all about how well you can compete with others. So if American industries were losing competitiveness, it means other countries were getting better at making and selling stuff, maybe offering lower prices or higher quality.
They're losing their edge.
Exactly.
We also saw the words vanished and casualty. What do those mean?
Okay, so vanished is like poof, gone, completely disappeared, like a magician making a rabbit disappear. A casualty is something that gets lost or damaged because of something else. So if an industry becomes a casualty of foreign competition, it means it got hurt really badly or even destroyed by those competitors.
Ouch. What about confidence, as in crisis of confidence?
Confidence is that feeling of being sure of yourself, like, yeah, I got this. So a crisis of confidence means people have lost that feeling and they're worried and unsure about what's going to happen.
Like they don't trust themselves anymore. Okay, another phrase that can be tricky is economies of scale. We talked about that sock factory, but can you give us another everyday example?
Sure, imagine you're buying apples. If you buy one apple, it might cost you $1. But if you buy a whole bag of apples, you get a discount, right? Each apple ends up costing less. That's because the store can sell them for cheaper when you buy a bunch at once. That's economies of scale in action.
So buying in bulk saves you money.
Basically, yeah, it's all about being efficient with how much you buy or produce.
Gotcha. And remember how the text said the machine tool industry was on the ropes? What's another way to visualize that?
Well, imagine a little restaurant struggling to stay open because a huge chain restaurant opened up across the street. The little restaurant's having a really hard time attracting customers and might have to shut down soon. You could say that little restaurant is on the ropes.
Okay, so it's in a really bad spot.
Yeah, basically.
All right, so let's finally tackle those multiple choice questions. I know a lot of you are like, what is going on with these? So question 1. The U.S. achieved its predominance after World War O because option A says painstaking efforts. What does that even mean?
Well, painstaking efforts, that means a lot of hard work struggling to achieve something. But the first paragraph talks about what happened after the war. It wasn't really about the U.S. working hard to get to the top. It was more like other countries were weakened and the U.S. just kind of ended up there.
So not really accurate.
Oh.
Okay, option B. Domestic market was 8 times larger than before. The text does say 8 times larger, but what's the catch?
It's not 8 times larger than before the war. It's 8 times larger than any competitor. That's a huge difference. They're comparing the U.S. to other countries, not to its own past.
Tricky.
Right. They're trying to throw you off.
So option C, the war had destroyed the economies of most potential competitors. How does this fit with the first paragraph?
This one lines up perfectly. The text says that the Europeans and Asians were worse off than Americans, prosperous beyond the dreams of the Europeans and Asians whose economies the war had destroyed. So yeah, the fact that other countries were struggling was a big reason why the U.S. was doing so well.
So that's our likely answer so far.
Definitely.
And option D, unparalleled size of its workforce. Now the text does mention most skilled workers, but what about the size?
Yeah, that's the thing. It doesn't specifically say the size of the workforce was the main reason why the U.S. was dominating the market. It's more focused on how other countries were weakened by the war.
So C is looking pretty solid.
Definitely sticking with C.
Okay, question 2. The loss of U.S. predominance in the world economy in the 1980s is manifested in the fact that the American, option A, TV industry had withdrawn to its domestic market. What does the text actually say about the TV industry?
It's way worse than just withdrawing. It says shrunk or vanished, which basically means it almost completely disappeared. Not just focused on the U.S. market, it's gone.
Yeah, that's a big difference. What about option B? Semiconductor industry had been taken over by foreign enterprises. Did that actually happen?
Not according to the text. It was more of a concern that it might happen. It says the semiconductor industry looked as though it could be the next one to go. So it's a prediction, not something that had already happened.
So not B then. What about option C? Machine tool industry had collapsed after suicidal actions. That sounds kind of harsh.
Yeah, and it's not in the text at all. It says the machine tool industry was on the ropes, meaning in trouble, but it doesn't say anything about suicidal actions. That's adding extra stuff that's not there.
Definitely not C then.
Oh,
So
yeah.
option D, auto industry had lost part of its domestic market. Now the text does say foreign-made cars were sweeping into the domestic market. What does that tell us about the American auto industry?
It means they weren't selling as many cars in the US anymore because people were buying foreign cars instead. So yeah, they lost a chunk of their market.
So D seems like the most accurate answer here.
Definitely the closest match to the text.
Okay, question 3. What can be inferred from the passage? So remember, infer means we got to read between the lines, figure out what's implied, but not directly stated.
Like a detective, right? We got to find those clues.
Exactly. All right, so option A. It is human nature to shift between self-doubt and blind pride. Can we really say that based on this one text about the U.S. economy?
That's a pretty big claim. The passage is about the U.S. going through this specific experience, but it doesn't say anything about it being human nature. That's like saying all birds can fly because you saw a pigeon flying.
Yeah, that's not quite right.
Okay.
Option B. Intense competition may contribute to economic progress. Now, the U.S. faced more competition in the 80s than things improved in the 90s. Could there be a link?
I think that's a reasonable conclusion to draw. It's like this tough times actually forced American industries to step up their game.
Adapt or die.
Yeah, exactly. So competition can actually be a good thing sometimes.
Option C. The revival of the economy depends on international cooperation. Did the U.S. team up with other countries to make this recovery happen?
Not that the text mentions. It's more focused on internal changes within the U.S., like restructuring and improving management. It's not about working with other countries to solve the problem.
So not really a good fit. And option D. A long history of success may pave the way for further development. Now, the very first sentence we looked at seemed to say something different, right? Like, sometimes success can actually hold you back.
Exactly. It's like that saying, what got you here won't get you there. Sometimes you got to change things up to keep succeeding, especially when the world around you is changing.
So we're going with B then.
B it is.
All right, last one. The author seems to believe the revival of the U.S. economy in the 1990s can be attributed to the A. Option A is turning of the business cycle. What do you think?
The text actually says most people didn't believe the recovery was only due to the business cycle changing, so the author probably agrees that other things were more important.
Okay, option B, restructuring of industry. That guy Richard Kavanaugh we talked about earlier,
Yeah.
he basically said that.
He said American industry has changed its structure, so that definitely suggests restructuring was a factor.
Option C, improved business management. William Salmon basically said this too.
Totally. His whole golden age of business management comment points to management being a key driver of the recovery.
And option D, success in education. Did they talk about education as the reason for the 90s boom?
Nope, not in this text. While education's definitely important, it's not highlighted as the main reason for this specific economic revival.
Okay, so it seems like B and C are the strongest contenders here, based on those expert opinions.
Yeah, it's likely a combo of those factors.
Now, think about someone who's studying for this kind of exam. What are some of the things they might struggle with when they hit a text like Text6?
Oh man, those long sentences, those are definitely a headache. It can be so hard to figure out what they're even trying to say, let alone answer questions about them. That's why breaking them down into smaller pieces, finding the main subject and verb, and looking for those connecting words, it's so important.
Yeah, I still do that, and I've been reading forever.
Right. It's a lifesaver. Another tricky thing is figuring out what's actually stated in the text versus what you have to infer. Sometimes people get caught up in their own ideas or what they already know instead of sticking to what the passage actually says.
Right, and there's vocabulary. Those big words can be intimidating, right?
Absolutely. Academic texts, they love to use those words that you don't hear every day. So building your vocabulary is huge, especially those common academic words.
The ones that show up on every exam.
Yeah, exactly. And even if you don't know a word, use the context, the sentences around it to try to guess what it means. Don't be afraid to look it up either. And be careful because sometimes words have slightly different meanings in academic texts compared to how we use them normally.
Context is key.
Always.
Any last tips for those multiple choice questions?
Read the questions super carefully, make sure you really get what they're asking. Then before you even look at the answers, try to find where the answer might be in the passage. Then go through each option one by one and see if the text actually supports it. Get rid of any that are totally wrong or not even mentioned. And for those infer questions, make sure your answer actually makes sense based on the passage. Don't overthink it. The answers are usually right there in the text.
Don't make it harder than it needs to be.
Exactly. Keep it simple.
All right, so to wrap up our deep dive into Text 6, we've talked about how to find the main idea, how to break down those crazy long sentences, how to deal with vocabulary, and how to handle those multiple choice questions. Remember, these are all skills you can get better at with practice. The more you do it, the easier it gets.
This particular text was about the U.S. economy, but the really important thing is that you practice those key reading and analytical skills. Those are going to help you with any academic text you come across, not just this one.
Here's something to think about. We saw how the U.S. economy went through this up and down journey, right? Success, then problems, then a comeback. Can you think of any other examples, maybe in a specific industry you're interested in, or even in your own learning process where you see the same kind of pattern? What can we learn from these ups and downs? Think about that until our next deep dive.
I like that. I like that a lot.
All right, till next time, happy reading, everyone.
Keep practicing.